Well, good evening. I do hope you can hear me. There was no sound with those slides. So a very warm welcome on behalf of Milim to this evening's presentation. Welcome to you wherever you are in the UK and indeed wherever you might be in the world. And I'm delighted to welcome our many international viewers once again. Our series of online talks and conversations continues with our guest, Jonathan Neumann, whom I will introduce in just a moment. A little bit of housekeeping first. Please do ask questions. We encourage and like you to do this. Please use the Q&A facility and type in whatever you'd like to ask. And as always, we will try our best to get through as many of your questions as we can. Let me also draw your attention to the chat facility on the screen. This allows you to send a message to all of the other participants on this webinar, should you wish to do so. We are recording this event. It will appear on the Milim website at milim.org.uk in the next couple of days. You'll find recordings of other past events there, as well as details of our future programme for which you can book tickets. And so to our speaker, Jonathan Neumann is a graduate of Cambridge University, the London School of Economics and the University of Law, Bloomsbury. A long-time advocate for Israel and a campaigner against anti-Semitism, he has written for various American, English and Israeli publications, was the Tikva Fellow at Commentary magazine and has served as assistant editor at Jewish Ideas Daily. Jonathan is the author of the best-selling book To Heal the World, How the Jewish Left Corrupts Judaism and Endangers Israel, which was published back in 2018 and is an excellent read. He joins us from Tel Aviv. Welcome, Jonathan. Nice to have you with us.
Lovely to be here. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you very much.
So I'll hand over to you and we will look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Great. Thank you. Let's just share the screen. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. Well, as I said, thank you very much, Jonathan, and Alan, everyone behind the scenes for making this happen. It's lovely to be here. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Let's crack on. I'm just gonna clock there so I can see the time. So as Jonathan said, I'm going to talk a bit about this idea of Tikkun Olam, which was the subject of the book that I wrote a few years ago, that you can see on the screen. So I'm going to make 5 points over the course of the presentation. They start off sort of less controversial and then will become kind of more interesting. So some of the earlier points we will run through perhaps a bit faster. So let's dive right in. How dominant is this concept of Tikkun Olam particularly in American Judaism? And this is particularly an American Jewish concept. Perhaps later we can discuss why that is the case, but this is predominantly an issue that we see in American Jewry. So how dominant is Tikkun Olam there? And the answer is that it is essentially a hegemonic concept in American Judaism. It has absolutely taken over American Jewish life. The polls show that it is the concept that overwhelming majority of American Jews are animated by, one that they recognize above all others. There are countless journals, magazines, articles, books written on the subject, innumerable rabbinic sermons on the subject. The major Jewish denominations in America are permeated with Tikkun Olam. It has totally taken over Reform Judaism in America. It has permeated conservative Judaism in America. It's essentially synonymous with the smaller renewal and reconstructionist movements, and it's made inroads into Orthodoxy in America as well. There are huge numbers of organizations in the American Jewish community that are dedicated or committed to Tikkun Olam in one way or the other as one of their principles, one of their values, one of their aims, and so on. Here's just an example. Some of these may be familiar to you, some less so, but this is just a sample of the range, and you see here a mix of reform and progressive organizations, Orthodox organizations, non-denominational organizations, pluralist organizations, and so on. And all of these in one way or another have some commitment to Tikkun Olam. It is the most widely recognized, we said, concept in the American Jewish community, and consequently, it is also American Jewry's most famous export prominent non-Jewish Americans are familiar with the concept and claim to draw inspiration from it, including presidents like Barack Obama and Bill Clinton, Governor Mario Cuomo, Professor Cornel West, and various other figures, congressmen, governors, senators, Supreme Court justices, and so on and so forth. This is really a concept that any American Jew could be expected to recognize and be familiar with. So there is absolutely no doubt of Tikkun Olam's central importance, so much so that it is widely believed to be a mitzvah or commandment, and not only that, but the mitzvah, the commandment that, as it were, encompasses all of Judaism and is essentially synonymous with the entirety of Judaism. So how dominant is Tikkun Olam? It is hegemonic. Okay, well, what is Tikkun Olam? So we've decided that it is essentially, as it were, taken over American Judaism. What is it? Well, it's commonly translated, as many of you will know, as repair the world, or heal the world, or perfect the world, and so on. But what is it? What is it actually? And the simple answer, and again, this is not really something that's in dispute, but the simple answer is that Tikkun Olam is social justice. Now, this is not just me talking, but I'm going to share with you a quotation from a leading figure in the Tikkun Olam movement, who rightly says that Tikkun Olam is used throughout the Jewish world to summarize the efforts of Jewish social justice movements. Jane Kanarik is a conservative rabbi and sits on the Rabbinical Committee of Law and Standards, which is conservative Judaism's juridical body, judicial body that decides on conservative Jewish law. So Tikkun Olam is social justice. And again, this is not really a point that is in dispute. But then we come to our third point. What is social justice? And in a nutshell, social justice is left-wing politics. Now, we're not at a judgment stage in this presentation. This is simply by observation. Social justice has an opinion on every issue under the sun in American political discourse, and on all of those issues, the opinion of social justice, or the opinions that come under social justice or associated with social justice, are invariably on the left wing of the political spectrum. And I want to give you some examples of this. This is a book called Righteous Indignation, which you may be seeing in reverse. Apologies. It was written about 15 or so years ago, and it is a collection of short essays by leading figures in the Tikkun Olam movement. And I also want to read to you just a sample of chapter headings, just so you get a sense of the kinds of issues that the Tikkun Olam movement deals with. You'll find that they cover the whole gamut of political issues, as we've said, and you'll also get a flavor for the politics from some of these titles. Divine limitation and human responsibility, preaching what I practice, the power of Jewish organizing, religious leadership and politics, rereading Genesis, human stewardship of the earth, Jewish textual practice and sustainable culture, wonder and restraint, a rabbinical call to environmental action, toxic waste and the Talmud, Judaism, oil and renewable energy, redemption for radicals, Jewish congregation-based community organizing, the blood of our neighbors, American healthcare reform, the Brownsville legacy, Judaism and reproductive rights, a Jewish vision for economic justice, why a labor movement matters, and if not together, how, Jews and immigration in the United States, gracious giver of wisdom, recovering America's great public school system, the possibility of change, an argument for restorative justice, the significance of sex, social order and post-mythic religion, created beings of our own toward a Jewish liberation theology, warriors, prophets, peacemakers, and disciples, a call to action in the face of religiously inspired violence, imitatio Dei and / as shared space, a Jewish theological argument for sharing the Holy Land, am I my brother's keeper if my brother lives halfway around the world, a Jewish response to globalization, silence is akin to assent, Judaism and the war in Iraq, and so on and so forth. So you get a sense of, again, the range of issues, everything under the sun in American political debate, and you already have gleaned a flavor of the kind of politics from the titles. And the quote that we looked at just a moment ago is from this book, from one of the essays. I want to bring you now a couple of quotes from other essays in the book. We've said that social justice is left-wing politics, but it's very important to understand that social justice is left-wing politics as distinct from charity. That often we subsume concepts like charity, volunteering, direct service, direct action, social action, these sorts of grassroots good works. We often subsume them under the rubric of social justice or Tikkun Olam, but they are in fact distinct. Now, very important that everyone understands that there is no question here that Judaism absolutely mandates charitable giving, and that includes to Jews and to non-Jews. The Gentile as well as Jewish naked should be clothed. The Gentile as well as Jewish hungry should be fed. The Gentile as well as Jewish vulnerable should be cared for. But that is the point, that social justice and charity are distinct. Now, again, this is not just me talking. Here are the three editors of this volume in their introduction, giving two illustrations, explanations of how charity and social justice are distinct from one another, and we'll come to a third in a moment. So what do they write? They say volunteering in soup kitchens is certainly an act benefiting the social good, as is visiting the sick and elderly. But direct service alone is simply not enough. Such action addresses only immediate needs and not root causes. Further, there are justice issues that cannot be addressed at all, foreign policy issues, for example, without political advocacy. So here we see two illustrations of this point, that social justice is politics and is distinct from charity. What are they saying? They're saying that volunteering in soup kitchens, which is a stand-in for any kind of charitable grassroots volunteering work, direct service, as they're referring to it here, that those things are all very good, visiting the sick and elderly and so on, all those things are very good, but they're not enough, because that kind of action only addresses immediate needs and not root causes. Allow me to illustrate that with an analogy that isn't mine. I got it from Sharon Brous, who is a progressive rabbi in Los Angeles, a leader in the Tikkun Olam movement, also has written in this volume. She also gave a opening invocation prayer at the Democratic National Convention a few years ago. And we were in a debate in Los Angeles on this topic, and she gave this analogy, which I thought was very apt. She said, imagine that you're walking down a trail, a path, and on your right, there is a river. And as you're walking along, and you look to your right, you look to the river, and suddenly you notice that there's a baby in the river. And you say, oh my goodness, there's a baby there, and the baby can't swim, the baby is going to drown. So you jump into the water, you swim to the baby, you rescue the baby, you bring the baby to shore, and then you carry on your way, and you look again to your right at the river, and you notice another baby, and you jump in again, and you save the baby, bring it to shore, and you carry on in your way, and you see another baby and do the same thing, and another baby, and another baby, and another baby, and so on. You are dealing with an immediate need, right? This is the kind of charitable work. You're addressing the immediate need of the baby drowning. This is equivalent to the hungry person in the soup kitchen. However, as you continue to walk and you continue to save the babies, eventually you start to wonder, what are all these babies doing in the river? How did they end up there? And as you're walking along, you notice that while the river is on your right, on your left, there's a cliff. And you look at the top of the cliff and you see babies coming off the top of the cliff, toppling from the top of the cliff into the river. Now, what is going on up there? Are the babies falling into the river of their own accord? Are they being thrown into the river from something or someone up there? It's not clear to you because you're obviously on the ground. So jumping into the river and saving the babies is addressing an immediate need, but the root cause, why those babies have ended up there, what exactly is happening at the top of that cliff, that is a root cause. That is what social justice, Tikkun Olam, are concerned with, not the volunteering, not the direct service, not the charitable work. They're interested in addressing that root cause, and that is a political endeavor, because you need to go up there and you need to assess, you need to review the situation, assess the situation, analyze it, and conceive, propose policies that will change the system up there that is causing the babies to end up in the river. That is a political endeavor. So that is our first illustration that social justice is distinct from charity. Our second is that they write further, there are justice issues that cannot be addressed at all, foreign policy issues, for example, without political advocacy. Now, this again is very important to understand, that while we may often associate issues like the economy, economic justice, the environment, environmental justice, and so on with social justice, actually all of the issues that fall under the rubric of social justice that we just mentioned in the sort of the list of titles, all of these political issues are equal. You can't build a socially just world if you don't attend to all of those issues, and some of them quite clearly cannot be addressed through charity and direct service and volunteering. No amount of volunteering and good works is going to change, for example, the American government's foreign policy towards or disposition towards particular countries, for better or worse. No amount of charity and volunteering is going to make America more or less dependent on multilateral institutions or on the military, and so on. Clearly, only political advocacy, lobbying, campaigning, making political contributions, running for office, etc., only that sort of work, that social justice work, can achieve the socially just ends in foreign policy. And the truth is that that is the case across the board. It's just more pronounced and more obvious in the case of foreign policy. So there we have two examples. Now we come to a third from a different essay by Jonathan Neumann, a prominent reform rabbi in America. He writes, "Too often in Jewish communal life, we confuse service-oriented work at soup kitchens with the work of redemptive social justice. These projects can undermine our commitment to systemic change." So again, we have the example of soup kitchens as a kind of service-oriented work, as charitable work, and that we confuse that work with the work of redemptive social justice, which is different. Social justice is different from the service-oriented work at soup kitchens, that kind of volunteering work. But he doesn't just say that they're different. He says that these projects, this kind of soup kitchen work, can undermine our commitment to systemic change, which is what social justice is all about. So how so? Well, there's a couple of ways, at least. Let's go back to our analogy of the babies in the river and the cliff. You are one person walking down this trail, you have limited resource, you can either continue to jump in and save babies, or you can take the arduous journey of climbing the cliff and assessing, as we said, analyzing, reviewing what is going on at the top of the cliff and trying to conceive of policies that will change the system, that will affect systemic change at the top. You can do one or the other. You're only one person, you only have limited resource, you have to choose which one it is. So by continuing to operate just at the level of the river, you are undermining the possibility of achieving that systemic change at the top of the cliff. But not just that. There is something also a little Marxist about this contention, namely that by working in the soup kitchen, you are, and helping, of course, the hungry people there, you are reducing the impact that hunger has in society. You are making it less painful than it might otherwise be by running an efficient soup kitchen. So what does that mean? What's the effect of that? Well, it's like in Marxist thought that by establishing a welfare state that provides a safety net and support for the proletariat, that they are not feeling the full impact of the capitalist system. and that it's preferable that there be no welfare state so that the proletariat really feels what it means to live in a capitalist economy, in a capitalist system, and therefore they will rise up and defeat that system. So similarly here, if the objects of our charity, if those who benefit from the charity and generally society as a whole doesn't provide the safety net for those who require it, then everyone will feel the real externalities, the real impact of those problems in society, and we will all be more disposed to working towards that systemic change. So again, we are dealing, and that systemic change is, again, in a sort of Marxist sense, redemptive. So that redemptive work is more important than the charity work, and it is distinct from it. So we've said so far that Tikkun Olam is a hegemonic concept in American Judaism. We've said that Tikkun Olam is social justice, and we've said that social justice is left-wing politics rather than charity. Well, Tikkun Olam isn't just social justice, right? It is Jewish social justice. So what is Jewish social justice? Well, Jewish social justice is exactly the same as regular social justice. It has exactly the same politics, exactly the same aims, with one difference. That difference being what makes Jewish social justice Jewish is the contention that the Jewish canon, that Jewish tradition, that Jewish belief and practices and so on support or justify that left-wing politics, that pursuit of left-wing politics. That's what makes Jewish social justice Jewish. Now, this is something that I look at length in the book. I look at all the various sources that the Jewish social justice or Tikkun Olam movement brings in support of its claim that Judaism, traditional Judaism, or Judaism has traditionally been understood and practiced, that it somehow supports, justifies these politics, the politics of social justice. And in every case, I find that once you subject those sources, those interpretations to scrutiny, they are found wanting, and that the Tikkun Olam movement consistently and persistently, selectively chooses sources, misreads sources, distorts sources, and occasionally even makes sources up. And I want to look at one example. We can do a bit of close reading, which might be a bit unusual in this sort of forum, but let's go for it anyway. And the source we're going to choose is one that's probably quite familiar to a number of you. It is the Aleinu prayer. The Aleinu prayer is originally from the Malchut, or kingship, section of the High Holy Days, Rosh Hashanah, New Year, Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement prayers, in the Musaf additional prayers, and it has since lifted from that prayer and inserted also into all of our daily prayers and even other prayers as well. So they will be familiar, it will be familiar to you from the daily morning, afternoon, evening prayers, all the weekly prayers, and so on. It is divided into two paragraphs. The first paragraph discusses the particular relationship between the God of Israel and the Jewish people. And the second sort of complementary paragraph talks about God's relationship with the whole world, has a more universalistic sort of thrust, and particularly looks at or envisions, aspires to a world in which all of the world, all of humankind will recognize that the God of Israel is the one God, which is why it is in the High Holy Days kingship prayers. Now, in the second paragraph that we're going to look at, there is the phrase "Litaken olam b'malchut Shaddai," to perfect or heal, fix the world under the kingship of God. And in the book, we look at the history of the Tikkun Olam concept, but this is the sort of original source of modern day Tikkun Olam. Just as a side note, As I said, in Hebrew, it is Tikkun Olam, to fix the world. That is almost certainly a corruption. And it is actually Tikkun Olam, to establish the world under the kingdom of God. There are various reasons why that is almost certainly the case. It's of course ironic because this is the original source of Tikkun Olam, and actually the word itself turns out wasn't actually meant to be there. But in any event, it is the original source, which is why it's not one that I'm sort of picking at random. We're looking at a chief source here. Let's have a quick read through it. Therefore, we put our hope in you, Adonai our God, to see soon the glory of your strength, to remove all idols from the earth, and to cut off completely all false gods, to perfect the world under the kingdom of God. And all living flesh will call your name, and all the wicked of the earth will turn to you. May all the world's inhabitants recognize and know that to you every knee must bend and every tongue must swear loyalty. Before you, Adonai our God, they will bow down and give honor to your precious name. And may all take upon themselves the yoke of your rule, and may you soon reign over them forever, because all kingship is yours, and you will rule forever and ever. As it is written in your Torah, Adonai will reign forever and ever. And it is said, Adonai will be ruler over the whole earth, and on that day, God will be one, and God's name will be one. So you see the universalism of this paragraph and why it features in the High Holy Days prayers that it does. So let's look at how the Tikkun Olam movement looks at a source like this. We're going to look at an analysis by Jill Jacobs, a conservative rabbi who is also the executive director of Trua, a rabbinic call for human rights, an organization that advocates for left-wing political prescriptions on issues like immigration and labor and so on. And actually, if you recall an earlier slide when we had the logos of various organizations, it was one of those. There. She is a very prominent figure in this movement. So again, not picking someone at random. This is a short, an extract from a short essay that she wrote in a now defunct left-wing Jewish journal called Zik. And in it, she deals with 4 of the kind of main clusters of where we see the phrase Tikkun Olam or some derivation of it in the Jewish corpus, in the Talmud, in Aleinu, as here, in the Midrash, and in Lurianic Kabbalah, the Kabbalah or mysticism of Rabbi Isaac Luria, the Arizal. Now, I've extracted the entirety of the analysis on Aleinu because I never like to be accused of having sort of distorted any of the sources that I brought. So it will be over a few slides. We can read it and analyze it together, and you can decide whether you think her argument is persuasive or not. So she says, the term Tikkun Olam appears first in the Aleinu prayer. The first section of the Aleinu prayer speaks of the greatness of God and of the particular relationship between God and the Jewish people. The second section introduces the promise that divine sovereignty will eventually encompass the entire world. Within the second part of the prayer, we find the line, Tikkun Olam Malchut Shaddai, to establish or fix the world under the kingdom of God. None of that is really in dispute. I'd only point out that she writes to establish / fix the world under the kingdom of God, because, as we mentioned, the Tikkun Olam is almost certainly a corruption. It means to fix, but it probably should be Tikkun Olam, which is to establish. So she sort of elided that issue there very conveniently. So we move on. To understand the meaning of the term Tikkun Olam here, we need to take a step back and to examine the context in which this line appears. Now, just to take a break for a moment, this is very true because the uses, the appearances of the phrase Tikkun Olam throughout Jewish sources across the different genres and so on and ages, it means different things in all these different places. The only way to understand what it means in any given context is to examine that context. So that's absolutely right, that is what she's endeavoring to do. She goes on, as indicated, the second section of the Aleinu prayer focuses on the promise of God's ultimate sovereignty. Immediately before introducing the concept of Tikkun Olam, the text pleads that idolatry will be swept away and false gods will be utterly destroyed. Immediately following the promise of Tikkun Olam, the text speaks of a time when all the people of the world will call out God's name. The triumph of divine sovereignty requires the elimination of any pockets of resistance to God's exclusive rule. I think she maybe labors the point a bit too much, because elimination sounds like a kind of active sort of thing, whereas this is, as she said before, more of a promise, more of an aspiration and a vision. But in any event, the general thrust is fair. She goes on, to our contemporary pluralist ears, the rejection of other religions appears intolerant and proselytizing. Most contemporary Jews who extol the value of Tikkun Olam certainly do not understand this term as a mandate to impose worship of the Jewish God on all other peoples. As I said, I would venture that the Aleinu prayer is not actually doing that either, but I would certainly agree that most contemporary Jews who extol the value of Tikkun Olam don't believe that. We may gain, she goes on, some consolation from understanding the Aleinu text as comparatively universalistic within the historical context. The biblical inspiration for this prayer is not the repeated injunction to wipe out idol worshippers and their altars, but rather the comparatively radical promise in Isaiah 56:7 that God will bring the other nations to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices shall be acceptable upon my altar, for my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples. Okay. Such apologetics, however, only go so far. Indeed, the arrogance of the Aleinu prayer is one of the reasons that many communities, including the one in which I most frequently daven or pray, do not recite this prayer out loud at all, and particularly reject the upbeat, campy tune often assigned to the end of the prayer. Some Reform and Reconstructionist communities have rewritten the text of the prayer. Again, it's just worth pausing to note the irony that this is the original source of Tikkun Olam that is so important in some of these, in all of these denominations, and yet some of the communities are essentially rejecting the entire prayer because they don't like what it is saying or appears to be saying. Don't worry, we're almost done. I think this is the second last of the slides on this extract. Still, if we put aside the specific issue of idol worship, or assume that most world religions do not practice idol worship as conceived by the Bible and early rabbis, we can learn from this prayer a sense that fixing the world means working toward the manifestation of divinity in every corner of the world. In our conception, this manifestation of divinity will not require the elimination of other means of religious worship, but rather the establishment of godly qualities throughout the world. So we've gone from the universalistic vision of the God of Israel being recognized by everyone to simply working towards the manifestation of divinity in every corner of the world, to the establishment of godly qualities throughout the world. And we go on in a comment on the line in question. David ben Rav Yosef Abu Draham, a 13th century Spanish liturgical scholar, explains, when the impurity is destroyed from the world, then the divine presence will return throughout the world and the world will be repaired. And finally, we can translate this idea of impurity into a modern context and say that the achievement of the Tikkun Olam will necessitate an end to all of the impurities, such as poverty and discrimination, that block the manifestation of the divine presence. And that's it. So apologies that it was a bit painful to go through, but again, I want to make sure that everyone is satisfied that we have looked at the whole thing in all of what I consider to be its absurdity. But again, you are welcome to draw your own conclusions as to whether you think this is a compelling analysis, that we went from, as I said, an aspiration that the God of Israel will be recognized by the entire world as the one God, to trying to work towards the manifestation of divinity in all of the world, to working towards the elimination of impurities, to working towards an end to poverty and discrimination. Now, you recall, we just looked at the Aleinu prayer, the second paragraph, a few moments ago. There was absolutely nothing, no reference to poverty in there whatsoever. I would contend that there was not even anything, any semblance of allusion to poverty. And as far as discrimination goes, to the extent that one thinks that the Aleinu prayer is actually inviting, encouraging, or mandating anyone to do anything, which it's almost certainly not doing, given that it opens with, therefore we place our hope in you, God, to do X and Y. But in any event, to the extent that one feels that it's requiring anyone to do anything, it would appear that discrimination is actually one of the things that precisely one is meant to do, or at least that the world in which everyone recognizes the God of Israel as the one God is a world in which there is discrimination, or at least has been discrimination, namely discrimination against other gods. So poverty appears to have been invented out of whole cloth, and discrimination, or the idea of ending discrimination, seems to be, to the extent that it is relevant at all, an inversion of what the prayer seems to be saying. And again, this is not just some random example of how the Tikkun Olam movement interprets texts to suit its purposes. This is a central text. This is a leading figure in the movement. And this is one of the only analyses actually available. This is about as deep as it gets on such a central text to the Tikkun Olam movement. So we've said that Tikkun Olam is hegemonic. We've said that Tikkun Olam is social justice. We said that social justice is left-wing politics and not charity. And we've said that Tikkun Olam is, in fact, Jewish social justice. And what is Jewish social justice? It's social justice plus Jewish sources, or the claim that Jewish sources somehow support the left-wing politics of social justice. That brings us to our final question, which is, so what? So what if Tikkun Olam is some dominant concept in American Judaism, to the point that many American Jews think it is synonymous with Judaism, or even an equivalent or replacement for Judaism? So what if Tikkun Olam is social justice? So what if social justice is left in politics and it isn't charity? And so what if they are using, misusing, abusing Jewish sources, corrupting Jewish sources even, to make the case? So what? Why is this bad? Well, there are three reasons, which I'll run through briefly, and we can always pick up in the Q&A if you would like. The first reason is that Tikkun Olam is not Judaism. Right, we've just seen an example of how the Tikkun Olam movement treats Jewish sources, and this is essentially endemic across the movement and across its encounter with Jewish sources. There is no honest encounter. There's no real intellectual interaction with these sources. The advocates of Tikkun Olam, of Jewish social justice, have their politics. They have their views. They're entitled to those politics, but they bring those politics to Judaism, to their encounter with Judaism and Jewish tradition, and they try to impose that understanding, those politics, onto those Jewish sources, onto the Jewish sources, in order to make them fit their politics. Again, no one is stopping anyone from having whatever views they want to have on healthcare, or on guns, or on taxes, or on the environment, or whatever it is. The issue is why the need to drag Judaism into it, or this form of Judaism that they have developed through this kind of eisegesis, this imposition of interpretation onto text instead of the drawing of meaning from texts. So, as someone who generally likes the idea of Jewish people and non-Jewish people understanding Judaism and understanding what Judaism is, and in the case of Jewish people, someone who likes the idea of Jewish people doing Judaism, observing Judaism at whatever level they are comfortable with, it does not sit well with me that many American Jews are practicing something, advocating what they are practicing as an advocacy of politics, believing that they are doing Judaism when in fact they are not, and giving a certain impression of what Judaism is to the outside world that is not accurate and not fair. So that's one reason that this is bad. It does not facilitate an intellectual engagement with Judaism and the Jewish tradition. But Tikkun Olam also has no place for a distinct Jewish people. Now, this is true theoretically, theologically, and empirically, that Tikkun Olam, essentially cannot make the case for why there should be a distinct Jewish people. So how is this true theoretically? Well, Tikkun Olam holds that the role of the Jews in the world is to engage in social justice, is to advocate for the left-wing politics of social justice. And Tikkun Olam also holds that it is the role of everybody else to engage and advocate for the left-wing politics of social justice. So if the principal role of the Jewish people and the principal role of the non-Jewish world is exactly the same, then there is no distinction between the Jewish people and the rest of the world. There is no place for a distinct Jewish people. And to the extent that Tikkun Olam is trying, which it is, trying to equalize the standing relationship, obligations and rights and so on of Jews and non-Jews, then it has no need for a distinct Jewish people, and a distinct Jewish people is even a hindrance to what it is trying to achieve. Now, how can something that everybody is meant to be doing also be the thing that is meant to set the Jewish people apart? So theoretically, Tikkun Olam has no place for a distinct Jewish people, but this is also true theologically. Now, the theology of traditional Judaism, traditional Jewish thought, is that the source of moral obligation for Jewish people is revelation, is the revelation of the Torah at Mount Sinai to the Jewish people. When a Jewish person is interested in understanding how, as a Jew, they should conduct themselves in a particular scenario, then ultimately the place they are looking for an answer is revelation, is the framework of commandments and obligations and rights and so on that emanate from revelation, whether one believes that those rules were given at Sinai or merely developed later on, but with the basis of Sinai, etc. Ultimately, the source of moral obligation is revelation. And what is unique about revelation is that only the Jews were there. It is a particular scenario where the God of Israel creates covenant with the people of Israel, and that covenant comes with various obligations and rights and so on. That is the traditional Jewish approach to the source of morality, as it were, moral guidance for Jewish people. For the Tikkun Olam movement, by contrast, the source of moral obligation is creation. It is not revelation, it is creation. Why is it creation? Because creation implicates everybody. Everybody was at creation, as it were. Through Adam and Eve, everybody was there, and any morality, any obligations or rights that emanate from creation apply to everybody, all of humankind, equally and the same. There is no special or peculiar or particular relationship between any particular people, any particular nation or people and God. There are no special obligations or rights incumbent on any particular people as opposed to any other people. Everyone is the same. Everyone has the same provenance, obligations, rights, and destiny. And if everybody has all of those things together, if everybody shares all of those things, then there is no scope for a people that maybe has a separate provenance, different obligations, different rights, and a different destiny. There is no place for a distinct Jewish people in the theology of Tikkun Olam. Again, something that is explored at length in the book. But finally, this is also borne out empirically, that if you look at Jewish people who are doing social justice work in a non-Jewish context, in other words, doing political advocacy on issue X through a non-Jewish organization, there is no evidence that such people can be drawn to doing that work through a Jewish organization in a Jewish context. In other words, there is no theoretical argument, there is nothing compelling that draws those people to do their work in a sort of universalistic kind of space, in a non-Jewish organization. There is nothing that draws them to do it in a Jewish organization. And why should there be? Because theoretically, there is no compelling reason, and theologically, the theology of social justice doesn't have a place for a distinct Jewish people, and actually trying to affirm the notion that there might be a distinct Jewish people that has some other role in the world is not persuasive, and is in fact a hindrance to the vision of Tikkun Olam, and indeed is why some of the leading theologians of the Tikkun Olam movement think that the idea of a distinct Jewish people is chauvinistic in and of itself. Finally, and we won't dwell on this, we can, given the time, we can always come back to it in questions and answers, but because Tikkun Olam has no place for a distinct Jewish people, it also has no need for a Jewish state. And Tikkun Olam essentially provides a theological rationale for the existing political hostility towards Zionism and towards the state of Israel that already exists. And I don't think it's in dispute that we see quite clearly, it's certainly not a novelty now, perhaps it was a few years ago, we see a hostility towards Israel in the social justice movement in general, Jewish people being who are flying flags with the Magen Davids, with Stars of David on them, and so on, getting booted from marches, all the issues with the women, the Women's March in America, and so on, all of these sorts of things. I don't think it's in dispute that social justice has a Israel problem, the social justice movement as a whole, but it's also no different in the Jewish context. The Tikkun Olam Jewish social justice movement also has an Israel problem. You see it with some of the leaders who say that they are uncomfortable with Zionism, that they've lost their Zionism, that they are post-Zionists, and so on and so forth, and that they provide, as I said, theological justifications for actually why you don't need a Jewish state, and actually why Jews, in fact, need to be in the diaspora, really, in order to do social justice. They shouldn't even be in Israel, and so on and so forth. So again, Tikkun Olam provides this sort of theological underpinning for that political hostility. So this dominance of Tikkun Olam is bad because Tikkun Olam is not Judaism, because it cannot make the case for why the Jewish people should endure, and because it has no need for a Jewish state. So, as I said, we've been through these 5 points that you have on your screen, and with that, I will close so that we can perhaps discuss some questions.
Well, that was really interesting. Thank you so much, Jonathan. If people have questions, please type them into the Q&A in the few minutes we have left. Tikkun Olam is a Jewish concept, obviously not the kind of Tikkun Olam you've been talking about. There is a Tikkun Olam, as far as I'm aware, in Kabbalistic sources and elsewhere. So how should we approach what appears to be a usurping of the term? It's difficult to talk about Tikkun Olam against the context of what you just explained.
Well, I guess there's two questions there. One, I suppose, is well, what is Tikkun Olam actually in sort of more traditional Jewish thinking, and then how do we approach this phenomenon of Tikkun Olam as it exists and as understood today? And I'll sort of address both kind of briefly. In terms of what Tikkun Olam actually is, again, it's something that's discussed quite a lot in the book as we look through all the sources and why the Tikkun Olam movement is wrong in what it is propagating, how it understands these sources. So inevitably we look at what the sources actually mean. As I said, in Aleinu, for example, Tikkun Olam is almost certainly not actually there at all. Speaking of places where it's not actually there, the Bible is another place where Tikkun Olam actually isn't there, which is just extraordinary, because given how many people think that Tikkun Olam is a mitzvah, is a commandment, is potentially the commandment, is somehow synonymous with Judaism as a whole, and yet it doesn't feature anywhere in the Bible at all, which is just, it's just extraordinary, because every other major concept from, as we said, Revelation and creation, the Sabbath, the kosher laws, the Messiah, everything else, every major concept in Judaism can be found in the Bible, either very explicitly or in a few occasions more implicitly. But Tikkun Olam, at least semantically, isn't there at all. It features in the Talmud, where it's more used very sparingly as a justification for small tweaks in various laws to try to stop people cheating the system, to try to uphold the system rather than be about systemic change. It's more about upholding the system. I'll give you one kind of well-known example. It comes up a lot in the issue of gets, in the issue of writs of divorce, where previously a man could send a writ of divorce to his wife who was living in a different place, could send that writ of divorce via an emissary. And if the man changed his mind after the emissary had left, he could, as it were, cancel that writ of divorce, but the emissary wouldn't know, and neither would the wife who is receiving the writ of divorce. She would then assume that she is divorced. She could then remarry, have children, and that could cause various problems and be unfair on of course the wife and on the new children and new husband and so on. So the rabbis, mipnei tikkun ha'olam, for the sake of repairing the world or fixing the world, or however, or fixing the community or sustaining the system, however you want to interpret it, they decided to prevent a man from changing his mind once an emissary had left. So far from wanting to affect the sort of systemic change that the contemporary advocates of Tikkun Olam are looking to do, instead, this is just trying to tweak the system to stop abuses. And it features, as you mentioned, in the Lurianic Kabbalah, also in the Midrash, and it means completely different things in all of these different places. It is not a coherent concept. It is just essentially words that are used and are used as rationales to mean very different things in very different places. It's not sort of a cogent concept that runs through Judaism at all. And honestly, before the last sort of 70 or so, 80 years, wasn't really given a huge amount of thought or attention. And the book obviously explains how it came to be, how the change came to be, and why we do give it so much attention these days. In terms of how to address the use of it today, it's more of an activist question. I have no kind of obvious answers other than to explain to people that it is an incorrect usage, encourage people to engage in an honest encounter with the sources, and in the hope that eventually people will come to stop using the term. And actually, there is some evidence in recent years that some people are keen to stop using the term, but in some ways for the wrong reasons, because they see it itself as too sort of chauvinistic, because it is a Hebrew term and potentially not inclusive, and so on. But the truth is, this is almost how I came to get interested in this topic, because I saw the phrase on a friend's refrigerator, on a notice they had received from their synagogue or some communal institution. And I said, this is almost certainly nonsense, and I was sort of goaded into justifying my claim, and so all of this work was born from that.
We have a question from Naomi Krim. She says, eye-opening. So does this explain strong democratic support by non-Orthodox Jews in the USA? I would add to that, how much of a risk do you see this to the cohesion of Jewish society in America? And what is the risk, if any, of people outside of America? A lot of thought. We're seeing sort of critical race theory and cancel culture and all of that kind of thing crossing the Atlantic. Do you think there's a risk of this misunderstanding landing on our shores in the UK?
Well, thank you, Naomi, for the question. Yeah, this is essentially a religious justification for engaging in left-wing politics in America, which obviously, as you say, finds its partisan form in the Democratic Party, to which the overwhelming majority of American Jews are committed and heavily invested. And to be clear, this is not to say that Jews cannot support the Democratic Party any more than they can support the Republican Party. Everyone will come to their own decisions about what is important to them, and which party And the same, obviously, in the UK, which party speaks to their interests the most. But what is particularly interesting about the way that Tikkun Olam sort of operates in American Jewish political discourse is that it provides this kind of theological justification for that kind of politics, almost to the point that how you vote can sort of determine whether, as it were, you're going to heaven or hell. This is, we don't sort of talk in these sort of stark terms, but I raise them because sometimes the Christian evangelical movement, which is obviously committed more to the American right, speaks in those terms, but is much more open about how it views the relationship between religion and state and the role that it believes religion should play in the public square, namely that it believes that God has a place and religion has a place in the public square, whereas supporters of Tikkun Olam don't believe that. They believe in a strict separation, as many do on the American left, between religion and state, church and state, and so on. But the irony, of course, is that they use religious justifications, or what I would consider to be faux religious justifications, to justify and explain, rationalize their political views. So whereas the Christian right is at least honest about what they're doing, as it were, Tikkun Olam Jewish left is disingenuous. On the one hand, saying religion has no place in our politics, but on the other hand, claiming some sort of religious mandate for the policies that it is pushing. Is this coming to coming to a synagogue near you? Is this coming to British shores? Yes and no. I would say that it is this phenomenon is of a completely different order in the United States. The principal reason being that the American Jewish community is, as far as I can think, the only and certainly the largest, if it's not the only, community in the Jewish world where the overwhelming majority is religiously progressive. Now, I hasten to add that this issue over Tikkun Olam is not simply or cannot be simplified to a sort of progressive versus orthodox issue, because as I said, it's making inroads into orthodoxy, and I criticize plenty of orthodox institutions in the book. And as we said in the earlier slide with the organizations, there were orthodox organizations there, and similarly there are plenty of progressive Jews, I've encountered them myself, who are appalled by the direction of their denominations and this takeover by Tikkun Olam. So it's not simply a progressive orthodox divide, but the majority progressive community in America that has sort of created a terrain for this sort of thing. We get echoes of it in the UK, but the terrain is simply too different. So it's not really something that we see on that level. Everything in America is always more extreme. There are examples I could give, but in the interest of time, if there's further questions, then maybe we should try one of those.
No, I think we've nicely concluded our discussion. So thank you for being our guest this evening. Jonathan's book is available on Amazon in a Kindle edition and a hardback. We'll put a link on the email we'll send out to you tomorrow. It's really worth reading. It's a thought-provoking and interesting book. And to say thank you to you, I'm going to send you some of my photographs. This is Magen David Adom in action, some in Tel Aviv and elsewhere. So that will be winging its way to you very soon. Now, just before we leave you, a few words about our forthcoming program. Next week on the 3rd of April, we've got the world-renowned economist and founder of Unified Growth Theory, Oded Galor. He's our guest, and he's speaking about his recent book, The Journey of Humanity, The Origins of Wealth and Inequality. And we then have a few weeks when it's Pesach, the Yoms, and a couple of bank holidays getting in the way. So we'll all be having a break until the 15th of May, when we'll be back with a live event featuring David Rich, author of Everyday Hate, How Anti-Semitism is Built into Our World and How You Can Change It. We have much more coming up. Please visit our website at milim.org.uk, sign up to our newsletter, and that way you will find out first what is happening and be sure not to miss anything. All of our online events are free, but you can make a small donation if you like. There's a link here in the chat, and you'll also find that on the website. It remains for me to thank our guest, Jonathan Neumann, once again. Thank you so much, Jonathan. And
Thank you, Jonathan.
And looking forward to seeing you all again soon. Until then, stay safe. Bye.